I think the problem with goal setting, so to speak, is that the focus is on an end product rather than the journey. And so ambition is fantastic. If you have ambition to keep going without attachment to an end result. Does that make sense? Being content with where you are, that you're on the path. Took me to Buddhism specifically. You know, schools of thought, philosophies, religions are a collection of beliefs and philosophies. And I had my own collection of beliefs and philosophies, just like everybody else. And it wasn't organized. It was Timborism. And I was very religious when it came to Timborism, but I didn't really know what it fit into. And I remember the first time I heard the Dalai Lama speak, he was talking about self-control, determination, and freedom from anger. And 3 years prior to that, I had those words tattooed on my chest. And so when I heard him, I was like, wait a minute. What? Yeah. So I started looking into it. And I initially went really deep into Tibetan Buddhism. That's when I was in full robes. And yet that didn't resonate very well because I'm not Tibetan. And so the cultural aspect of it didn't resonate with me. And it didn't really fit. You know, you read a lot of books about spirituality and whatnot. And I would read them going, well, that's great if you're living in a cave in India. But what about if you're living day-to-day life? You know, how do you deal with that? And I just felt like the Tibetan aspect of it was very visually overstimulating for me. All the colors and the chanting and the visual depictions of Mara and I just thought that was too much. And so the teacher said, try Zen. I think you might like it. And I did. It was just, there's nothing. There's none of that. It's just blank walls. And when I moved into the Zen monastery, that was, you know, we spent a lot of time silent, and that was great, but there was chanting, there was still the dogma underneath. And I compare it a lot to, like, dance, for example. There's like 800 schools of Buddhism, right? And let's say you like dance, and so you sign up for a ballet school. And that's great. You're like, okay, that's awesome. And then when are we going to do hip-hop? And they go, oh, we don't do that. When are we going to do jazz? Oh, we don't do that here. What about modern? We don't do that. And you like dance. Not, you know, ballet is one of them. And so what happened was if you funnel it to one school and just Zen, it's like, well, what about this? Well, we don't do that here. Well, what about, we don't do that here. And I found when I moved from Israel to the States, and I was all of a sudden in a big culture shock because I went from a tiny little town where everyone was white and Jewish to San Francisco, where my high school had 3,000 students and only 6 of us were white. And all of a sudden, all these different cultures, December rolled around. I don't see one here. But people started putting dead trees in the living rooms. It's very confusing to an outsider. But instead of getting judgmental, I got really curious. And I asked questions, and I got to understand. And so my altar at home has the Buddha on it, but it has Jesus on it, and it's got St. Francis on it. And they get along just fine. So I'm drawn to a lot of stuff. The reason it's called Buddhist Boot Camp is not because there's anything in there about Buddhism. And spoiler alert, there's nothing in there you don't already know. And I'm not in any way condoning that you go out and watch this movie, but if you've seen Fight Club, every time I watch Fight Club, I thought to myself, that's Buddhist Boot Camp. Because it takes the Buddhist principles. If you really listen to Tyler and just overlook the unbelievably graphic violence in the movie, and you really listen to Tyler, it's the Buddhist principles, and they're just pounded right into you. Even all the violence in the movie depicts actually the internal violence in all of us, the internal struggle in us, the two sides of us that are beating each other up. And that's why the cover of the book has half of me in dark and half of me in light. And it's really not about doing away with one of them, like saying I want to do away with anger because then you're focusing on anger, but finding peace with both of them and honoring both of them, that within me there's both sides, but I'm going to vow today to follow this side. And that's the invitation, is to make that commitment and stick with it. Does that make sense? All right.
So, just amazing.
Thank you. For those of you who didn't hear in the back, I assume a lot of you, it just shorthanded, she spent a year in the hospital, and when she got out, she spent the following year angry at what happened to her and to her family. And it was through the book that she found a different way to look at the situation and realized how much of the anger she was causing in herself, and that it wasn't harming necessarily other people that you are aware of, but it was harmful to yourself. A really big change in language, I keep going back to that. Instead of saying this is happening to me, change that to this is happening for me. Whatever it is, no matter how devastating, which is again a label of a situation, when you say this is happening for me, that you're inviting yourself to look at it from another perspective. Why is this happening, and what can I learn from it? Not why is this happening, and I need to come up with a supernatural reason as to this is happening because of this and this. But what can I learn from this? This is happening for me. And that's such an incredible... I had a near drowning experience that was the most incredible experience in my life. I get really happy just talking about it because it was amazing. I nearly drowned. I broke so many bones. My bone was sticking out of my leg. I was in the hospital for... But it was incredible. It happened for me. So much was there for me to learn, but I'd never called it an accident. I never called it a bad thing. I never judged it. We're so quick to... Every label is a form of violence. So just be careful with those labels. Whatever you put on yourself, it's very limiting. Like the Dalai Lama says, don't try to take what you learn from Buddhism to be a Buddhist. Just be a better whatever you already are. It's not about labeling yourself as any one thing. I was in full robes for a couple of years, and this kid comes up to me and he runs up and he's like, I have so many questions for you. We're on a street corner in Hawaii, and he wanted to just spill his whole life and tell me. And he just went into this whole spiel. He's like, well, my name is Peter, and I'm a freshman college student, and I used to be Christian, and then I converted to Judaism, and I'm gay, and I'm Asian, and I'm this. And it was just every time he said, I just felt like a sticky note was stuck to him, and I'm just like, whoa, and that was not the time or place. I took one of those stickies off, I wrote my number down. And he called and he left a voicemail saying, hi, this is Peter. I'm that gay Asian freshman Jewish college student. I was like, and that, it again, we're going back to how I started, is the danger of we have this false identity. We're identifying with so many things, which is really limiting us and our experience in the world, because we say, I'm only one thing. I'm a lot of things, and not one of them defines me. And so... careful with those labels when you put them on yourself, because then you're very likely to start labeling other people as well, and people and situations. Good, bad, right, wrong. It just is. If we walk down the street and you were attacked by a dog when you were a little kid, and you're scared of dogs, and I love dogs, and this big bulldog's running towards us, I think it's the cutest thing in the world. You think it's the scariest thing in the world, but the dog is neither. It's just a dog. It's, again, the story we built around it. So drop the stories, drop the labels. It's so freeing. The first principle in Buddhist Boot Camp is that the opposite of what you know is also true. And I know that's really difficult for people to digest, but that's why it's the first principle, because once you accept that the someone else, somewhere else, taking their time, place, and circumstance into consideration, the opposite of what is your truth is their truth. And that opens your heart to so much compassion and understanding that, I went to school to study about the Holocaust so I can turn around and teach kids about the Holocaust. But most importantly is to sit down and have conversations with members of the KKK, for example. Not to condone any of that behavior, but to understand. How did you end up where you are? And they tell you their story about wanting to fit in, and the abuse they went through, and wanting to have a family unit that included them, that they felt like a part of something. And it's strange for communities to almost always need to have an enemy figure, because it creates cohesion in the group. And so you listen to the story of this, and I totally understand why, considering your time, place, and circumstance, you chose what you have. And it's not a lifetime decision. We are not what we have done in the past. We are who we choose to become today. So you're not a victim of your past choices. You can choose today to be whatever you want to be. Write it down. And then ask yourself, or even someone close to you, to mirror back to you, are your decisions in line with your values? There's a chapter in the book that ends, what is detrimental to your health? Why are you still doing it? Right? Again, there's not a single should statement in the book. I think that's another reason why it worked so well. I'm not telling anybody what to do. Again, these were emails to my friends to keep them in line with what's happening in my life. And I'm just a sharer. And I invite you to share with others. You'll find that the minute you do, those insecurities you're struggling with and keeping so private, we're all having them. It's okay to talk about it. You'll actually feel closer and more connected. And in fact, you might find that some of the stuff you think is so important is not so important, because you'll realize what a big deal someone else is making about it, and that it's really not that big a deal. It's not a question of stopping. And when you do feel discouraged, look around you and you'll see there's a lot of us on this path together, and we're all holding hands.
Do you think it's related to greed?
To greed? I think that depends on your intention. Yeah, the question was if it's related to greed. It's kind of like when I was at the monastery. If I had stayed there, it would have been for totally selfish reasons because I liked it. But because I believe we're here to learn to be completely selfless, and my intention was to learn to be selfless, to go about it by doing the most selfish thing I could think of, was not in line with my values. And so even though every part of me wanted to stay there, I think staying there would have been really greedy. Does that make sense? If the book was 20 pounds, the intention wouldn't have been so apparent. And so for me, it's really important to be very transparent about what I'm doing. You know, I couldn't do this and pull it off while pulling up here in a limo. That just would not. Does that make sense? So, intention, integrity, and just keep those in check and go, why am I doing this? Is this greedy? Is this for self-gain? Or is this in line with my intention to heal, to empower, to enrich, and inspire? And then follow that every single time, and you'll be okay. Thank you. I had no intention to write this one. Again, I never set out to write this one. It just kind of happened. My friend suggested that I publish those emails that I've been sending for 8 years, and I went through and edited them, put them together, and that's what you have in your hands. I'm asked a lot if I have an intention to write another book. A really big part of me says absolutely not, because there's nothing more I feel like I need to say. Be kind, be generous, be grateful. That's really it. Just be grateful. I mean, I've said it. That's it. Like, how many? I mean, yes, we need to be beat on the head with it, but. And you know, all of you, most of you said, oh, a friend gave me this, or a friend told me about this. And that's, again, the invitation is, don't keep this to yourself. Share it with others. My housemate, on the other hand, says she's under the impression I have a lot more to say. And if and when I continue writing, so maybe one day it'll be compiled again. But I'm in school now for the next 6 years to learn sign language. And deaf culture, and that's where my focus is now, and that's why I'm here now. This is my short break from school, and then winter session starts as soon as I get back. But I'm not saying it's not going to happen, but it's definitely not like I'm not on some fast track to mass produce books and keep publishing a new one every year and create that's not who I am. I don't identify myself as an author at all. So.
It's just good to know. It's just good to read things that makes an impact.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I'm grateful that this is making an impact. And then do that, because I don't need to write another one to do the same thing. I don't think. I don't know. We'll see. But
we want new stuff to read.
Do you want new stuff to read? It's not about taking in so much new. It's about letting go of the old. You know, and you know this intellectually, but really. It's like I read a book in '93 called Meditation by Eknath Easwaran, and you guys have Eknath Easwaran downstairs. I just saw him, but not that book. It's out of print, and I truly believe that book has in it everything you need to know. Now I read it, and then I read it 10 years later, and I was almost mad at myself. I'm like, wait, you knew this 10 years ago? It's because we're not always ready to absorb it all, and we need to go back and reread, and we're different now than we were 10 years ago, so we'll receive it differently. In fact, I was at a book talk in Virginia, and this one guy gave me this really weird look throughout the entire talk. He was just like, I'm like, oh boy, when I open the floor for questions, he's just gonna, and sure enough, his hand was the first one to go up. And he asked, have you read Buddhism Without Beliefs by Batchelor? Is that Stephen Batchelor? And I said, no, I haven't, but I had an 8-hour drive the following day, so I got the audiobook and I listened to it. And my jaw was like on the ground the entire time because he said exactly what I'm saying, but his delivery was so different. It's way more scholarly, which I really resonate with and I really appreciate. But, you know, and I told my author, I said, my publisher, if I had read that first, I probably wouldn't have even published Buddhist Boot Camp. I would have just spent my life promoting his book because it's brilliant. But my publisher said that they're really glad I did because I'm reaching an audience that Batchelor is not, and he is that I'm not. So it's really wonderful that there are so many out there speaking different languages through different mediums. There's movies out there that are doing it, documentaries, books, audio, video. And so it's fantastic. If I have more to say, I promise I won't keep it to myself. It's about to talk about my transition from to a more simplified life. And I actually moved from San Francisco to Seattle, and then Seattle to Hawaii. And the reason that's important is because when I moved from the Bay Area to Seattle, I took a 50% pay cut. I was still a paralegal. I was in the law firm for 10 years. But my pay was cut in half, but I was twice as happy. And the reason that's really important in the transition is because I didn't go from San Francisco to Hawaii. I actually had this stepping stone and a big light bulb to go off that how happy I am has nothing to do with how much money I'm making. That was really an important transition to simplifying my life. Because up until that point, the sports car and the designer Italian furniture and the designer clothes were all very, very important to me. And to my parents, you know, when they would come to visit. And they were very proud to talk about their son and his accomplishments, so to speak. Never mind that I was miserable. But on Facebook, I would have appeared very happy. There was no Facebook back then, but... So the transition was first that how happy I am has nothing to do with how much money I'm making. That was really important. Secondly, there was a time at the law firm when another paralegal was celebrating her 30-year anniversary at the firm. And the fact that she was celebrating 30 years in a cubicle terrified me. Because I knew that's me in 20 years if I don't get out, because I had been there for 10 years already. So that was another important transition to simplifying my life. I had a lot of credit card debt, and so making all that money was important. But at one point, I was one payment away from being debt-free. And so the first thought in my mind was the natural thought, so to speak, or unnatural thought. What am I going to do with all that extra money? If I don't have to send Citibank $1,000, what am I going to do with that $1,000? And I'm really glad that at that time, instead of thinking, what am I going to do with it, I thought, well, I don't have to make that $1,000. I can make less. Which means I can work less. Ooh, what would I do with all that extra time? That changed. So it was a very, not slow transition, but it was very progressive. It wasn't like 1 minute I was there and the next minute it was a sequence of events and decisions that then led me to sell everything I owned that I knew didn't matter. Because in Hawaii, it doesn't matter, you know, who made your board shorts, which is all you're wearing anyway. And you're spending most of the time on the beach with people who don't care about your dining table at home because you're eating off of a paper plate in the sand after playing volleyball all day. And so what was important really changed. It wasn't the people, it wasn't the table you're eating dinner on, it's who's with you at dinner. And so everything shifted, and living a simplified life became a game. How little can I make and still be okay? It's become fun. You know, how few hours a week can I actually work? And that opened the door to studying more, reading more, traveling more, surprisingly enough, because you would think, well, there's no money, there's no travel. Surprisingly enough, it all works out somehow okay, because my intention wasn't to define myself by the amount of money that's in the bank. Again, Fight Club, have you seen it? You're young enough, watch it, it's okay. One interesting thing, I posted a thing online the other day, it's like a rocking chair. It gives you something to do, but it won't get you anywhere. One of my favorite lines from Fight Club is when someone says something, you're like, oh, I worry all the time. I ask them, well, how's that working out for you? And that's an invitation to go look within and go, well, how is that working out for me? And it's not, which you're already there saying, okay, I'm aware of the fact that I worry more than I should for my own health, and I want to stop worrying. And then you're worried about worrying too much. I know, it's a vicious cycle. I may be wrong here. I think it was Shantideva who said, and correct me if you know this better than I do, that if you can do something about a situation, then there's no reason to worry about it. If you can't do something about a situation, then it's useless to worry about it. Either way, worrying is it's a waste of time, and you know this. Practice naming that demon. Give her a name, Wilma. And so when she shows up, just be aware. It's just like, Wilma, I don't want you in my life anymore. You know, just I see you, and I see that you even have logical reasons to worry about it. But most of the stuff we worry about never happens. We know that as well. And a lot of us, because of our exposure to a lot of the media, the news and whatnot, a lot of it is paranoid, and so they give you reasons to worry, right? I don't know if you have any exposure to television, radio, magazines, newspapers, but that could be feeding your worry. People ask me all the time, aren't you worried? You're staying with strangers all across the world, just like, aren't you? And I'm like, no, because maybe it's related to having no fear. Is everything that we feel, everything that we think either stems from love or from fear. And so your worry is quite often fear-based. And there's, if you let go of that fear, there's nothing to worry about. I'm not afraid of people email me, well, do you know the weather in London is going to be so terrible and all this stuff. I'm like, it's so useless for me to worry about that. I'll bring the one jacket I have, and if it's not enough, hopefully my host has another one, or I'll be okay, or there will be heat, or but to worry about it is completely useless. So when I catch that happening, I moved to California and I wanted to go to school, and then I was really worried, but I can't afford to go to school because if you're not a resident of that state, it's really expensive to pay out-of-state tuition. But I was like, but it's pointless for me to worry about it. Let's apply. Let's see what happens. So I applied. I got accepted. Okay, great. Are you a resident? No, I'm not. Well, you realize it's like $200 per unit, which is about $1,000 per class, just to go to school here if you're not a resident. But they have an exemption. Turns out if you lived in California and went to high school in California, you don't have to pay out-of-state tuition. And so if I had worried about it, it would have been a waste of time, because it turns out I don't have to pay it anyway, because I'm exempt, because 18 years ago I went to high school in that state. Fast forward even more. Okay, so now I have to pay $40 per unit, which is less, but I was still, quote-unquote, worried about how am I going to pay for it, right? Turns out I don't have to. Why? Because according to the government, I'm in poverty. And if you're in poverty, they'll pay for your school. And so worrying about it doesn't solve anything. Not worrying about it opens you up to look and see other possibilities that you will never see if you're only focused on what to worry about. Because you're just looking at everything that can go wrong. What about everything that can go right? So many wonderful things can happen, but they'll never happen in your life if all you're looking at is the dark. They're both there, and yes, the weather could have been terrible, and I could have gotten soaking wet on my way here. And I didn't know you couldn't just drive up in front of the bookstore, but I'm grateful my publishers here in the UK, they're standing back there, and I'm so grateful for them, because they were like, oh, do you realize there's no parking there? And I'm like, oh, okay, I'll figure something out. And I did. My host knew exactly where I was. And it's too late for long story short, but bring awareness to it, give her a name,